A drone spots a torn tent in the mountains, solving a family disappearance from 2004. The drone's camera feed was a nauseating, jittery stream of white for 3 hours. That's all 22-year-old Benji had seen: snow, rock, and the occasional skeletal finger of a dead pine tree clawing its way out of a drift. He was getting paid $100 by the local forestry service to run a grid search over the unmapped sections of the Sawtooth Range. A job that sounded cool on paper, but was, in reality, as exciting as watching paint dry, only colder. His fingers were numb, even inside his trailer, and his eyes burned from the relentless glare. He was about to call it a day, to land the expensive toy and go pour a whiskey, when a flicker of color broke the monotony. It was a violent slash of blue against the white. Benji leaned closer to the monitor, his breath fogging the screen. He toggled the joystick, nudging the drone lower, fighting the wind shear that buffered the small craft. The image stabilized. It wasn't a rock or a trick of the light. It was fabric, ripped and flapping in the gale, a tattered blue flag of surrender. As the drone descended, the shape resolved itself, a tent, or what was left of one. It was almost completely buried, clinging to a narrow, precarious ledge just below a cornice of unstable-looking snow. No one in their right mind would camp there. It was a death trap, a place you'd only end up by accident, and a bad one at that. He zoomed in. The blue nylon was shredded, not just by wind, but by force. It looked like something had clawed its way out, or in. A strange dark stain marred the snow near the tent's opening, a frozen splash of something that looked disturbingly like rust. Benji's heart began to thump a nervous, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't right. He was supposed to be looking for signs of illegal logging or avalanche risks. Not this. He checked his GPS overlay. The coordinates were deep in a sector marked as inaccessible by foot. He was miles from the nearest trail, in a place the old-timers called the Widow's Needle for the spire of rock that loomed over the basin. A protocol manual, thick and unread, sat on the table beside him. He was supposed to report any anomalies, any signs of human activity, to his supervisor. But the $100 barely covered his gas and the cheap whiskey he'd drink tonight. A real discovery, something important that might be worth more. A bonus, maybe, or at least a story to tell that didn't involve counting trees. He pushed the joystick forward, sending the drone on a slow, circular path around the wreckage. The camera panned across the shredded fabric, and then, behind it, caught something else. A flash of red. He maneuvered the drone closer, the rotors whining in protest against the thin, icy air. It was a child's boot. A small red rubber boot, lying on its side, half filled with snow. Just the one. Benji's blood went cold. He'd grown up in this town. He knew the stories, the ghosts that haunted these mountains. Every local kid did. He knew about the Holloways, the family of 4 who had vanished from the Starlight Creek campground in the summer of 2004. A father, a mother, and their 2 small children. They'd been there 1 minute, their campfire still smoldering, their car still parked, and gone the next. The search had been massive, the biggest in the state's history. It had turned up nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue. They had dissolved into the mountain air, swallowed whole by the wilderness. The case had become a local legend, a cautionary tale told to scare kids into staying on the marked paths. He stared at the little red boot. The Holloway girl, Sarah, had been 5. He remembered the missing posters, her smiling, gap-toothed face plastered on every telephone pole and storefront window. She'd been wearing red boots in the photo. His hands were shaking now. This couldn't be. It was 20 years ago. The tent would have been obliterated, the boot buried under 2 decades of snow. But this winter had been different. A freakishly warm spell in February, followed by a series of violent windstorms, had scoured the high peaks, stripping away layers of snow that hadn't seen the sun since the last millennium. Old things were being uncovered. A woolly mammoth tusk had been found by a hiker just last month. He had to be sure. He needed a better look. He sent the drone lower, dangerously low, skimming the surface of the snow. The wind was a monster, up Here, a sudden gust slammed into the drone, and the video feed bucked wildly. He fought the controls, his knuckles white. The drone stabilized, its camera now pointing directly at the torn opening of the tent. He pushed the zoom. The lens punched in, the image pixelating for a second, before sharpening. Inside, it was dark, a cave of frozen blue shadows. But there was something in there, a shape, a mound covered in frost. He squinted, his face inches from the screen. It looked like a sleeping bag. Or two, huddled together. And from the top of the nearest one, something protruded. Benji felt a surge of bile rise in his throat. It was a hand. A human hand, frozen solid, the fingers curled into a claw. The skin was pale and waxy, like a mannequin's, but the fingernails were chipped and dirty. It was reaching, stretching out from the sleeping bag, as if, in its last moment, it had been trying to grab something, or someone. He yanked the drone back, his heart hammering. This was it. This was them. After 20 years, he had found the hallways. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and numb. He had to call it in. He had to tell someone. But, as his thumb hovered over the screen, a new thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through his panic. The father, Mark Holloway, had been a geologist. An amateur, but a passionate one. The local paper, in its anniversary coverage of the disappearance, had mentioned that he was rumored to have been searching for something. A lost gold mine, some people said. Others whispered about something more valuable, something the mining corporations would kill for. The story had always been dismissed as local gossip, a romantic flourish to a tragic mystery. But what if it wasn't? What if he'd found it? A family doesn't just hike into a place called the Widow's Needle by mistake. They were running from something. Or, they were carrying something so valuable they were willing to risk a place no one else dared to go. Benji looked from his phone back to the monitor. The drone hovered, a silent, buzzing witness. He could make the call, be the local hero who solved the 20-year-old mystery. He'd get his name in the paper, a pat on the back from the sheriff. Or, he could see what else was up there. He could take a look for himself. The thought was insane. The area was inaccessible. But the drone wasn't, it was his eyes. Greed, sharp and intoxicating, warred with his fear. He thought of his rust bucket truck, his perpetually overdrawn bank account, the suffocating smallness of his life in this forgotten mountain town. This could be his ticket out. He took a deep breath, the decision hardening in his gut. He wasn't going to call anyone, not yet. He toggled the controls, turning the drone away from the tent. He was going to follow the direction the hand was pointing. It was reaching for something. He sent the drone skimming over the snow, past the tattered tent, towards a dark cleft in the rock face, about 50 yards away. It was a narrow fissure, almost invisible against the shadowed cliff. As the drone approached, its signal began to waver. The rock walls were interfering with the transmission. Come on, he muttered, pushing the drone forward. The video feed flickered, dissolving into static, then cleared again. The drone was inside the fissure. It was a cave, not a natural one. The walls were too smooth, too even. It was a tunnel, an old mine shaft. The drone's small LED headlight cut a weak beam through the oppressive darkness. The floor of the tunnel was littered with debris, but there was a path, a trail of disturbed dust and rock leading deeper inside. He followed it. The signal was getting weaker, the video breaking up into a mosaic of static. He was about to lose it. He had to pull back. But then the light caught it. At the very edge of the drone's range, something glinted. It was metal, a box, an old steel lockbox, the kind used for storing documents or valuables. It was half open. Spilling from it, like a river of frozen gold, was a cascade of something. He couldn't make it out. The image was too degraded. He pushed the drone an inch farther. The screen went to snow. No, he slammed his fist on the table. He pulled back on the joystick, praying the drone would reacquire the signal. For a heart-stopping minute, there was nothing. Then, a flicker. The image returned, shaky and distorted. The drone was back outside the cave entrance. He had to go back. He had to see what was in that box. But he knew the drone couldn't make it. The signal wouldn't hold. There was only one way to know for sure. He had to go up there himself. The thought was terrifying. But the image of that box, the glint of whatever was inside it, had burned itself onto his brain. He looked at the GPS coordinates on the screen. He knew a guy, an old-timer named Silas, who lived off-grid at the base of the range. Silas knew these mountains better than anyone. He'd been a search and rescue volunteer back in '04. He'd been one of the first on the scene at the Holloway's empty campsite. He'd probably say Benji was crazy. He'd probably try to stop him. But Silas also had a snowmobile, a powerful souped-up machine that could, just maybe, get him close enough. Benji saved the drone footage, his hands moving with a new, feverish purpose. He shut down the system, packed up his gear, and threw it into the back of his truck. He didn't go for the whiskey. He drove, his tires spitting gravel, down the winding dirt road that led away from his trailer and towards the dark, jagged silhouette of the Widow's Needle. He was no longer just a drone operator. He was a treasure hunter, a grave robber. He was the only person on Earth who knew the secret of the Holloways, and he was about to climb into their tomb. The cold knot of fear in his stomach was still there, but now it was wrapped around a core of hot, thrilling adrenaline. He was terrified, and he had never felt more alive. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood and bruised purple. It was the color of a secret that had waited 20 years to be told, and he was the only one listening. He floored the accelerator, the engine screaming in protest as he raced towards the mountain. Towards the money, towards the dead. He had to get there before someone else did, before the next storm buried it all again, this time for good. He was gambling everything on a ghost story, and the little red boot, and the frozen, reaching hand. He just hoped to God he wasn't about to become a ghost story himself. He had the coordinates, he had the greed. All he needed now was a way up. The rest, he figured, he'd make up as he went along. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the drone hadn't been the only thing watching that day. Someone else knew the secret of the Widow's Needle. Someone who had kept that secret for 20 years. And they were not about to let a kid with a drone and a death wish get in their way. The real story wasn't about what the Holloways had found, it was about what had found them. And it was still up there. Waiting. The year 2004 smelled of pine, needles, and damp earth. For 11-year-old Ethan, it smelled like freedom. His father, Mark Holloway, was a man obsessed with maps and rocks. His eyes always fixed on the horizon, searching for something Ethan couldn't see. He was a geologist for a faceless corporation during the week. But on the weekends, he was an adventurer, a treasure hunter, dragging his family on expeditions into the sprawling wilderness that bordered their town. His mother, Linda, usually went along with a sigh and a well-packed cooler, her quiet presence a gentle anchor to his father's restless energy. She would read novels in a folding chair, her lips curved in a soft, tolerant smile, while Mark Holloway hammered at rock outcroppings and muttered about quartz, veins, and sedimentary layers. But this trip was different. The energy was sharp, brittle. His father's usual buoyant optimism was gone, replaced by a tense, almost paranoid watchfulness. He'd bought a new tent, a heavy-duty 4-season model, and a GPS device that cost more than their television. He'd spent weeks poring over topographical maps that were so old they were brittle and yellowed, cross-referencing them with satellite images he'd printed out at his office. He was secretive, his voice dropping to a whisper whenever Ethan or his 5-year-old sister, Sarah, came near his desk. "This is it, Lynn," Ethan had heard him say to his mother one night, his voice a low, urgent hum through the thin wall of their suburban home. "Everything I've been working for. One more trip, it'll change everything for us." "Mark, it's dangerous," his mother had replied, her voice strained. "The kids, it's safer than staying here, with him breathing down my neck. We'll be gone before he even knows I have it. A few days, that's all. We'll be ghosts." The him was a shadow that had fallen over their house in recent months. A man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was his father's boss, a senior partner At the mining company, he was a man who seemed to be carved from the same granite as the mountains he sought to exploit. He had a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, and a handshake that felt like a threat. He'd been to their house for dinner once. He'd patted Ethan on the head with a hand that was heavy and hard, and he'd looked at his father's collection of geological maps with an unnerving proprietary interest. After he'd left, his father had started locking the door to his study. Now they were here, at the Starlight Creek campground, but they weren't staying. This was just the staging ground. The real destination was somewhere off the map, a place his father called the Needle's Eye. Sarah, oblivious, was chasing a butterfly, her red rubber boots thumping on the soft ground, her laughter echoing through the tall pines. She was a splash of bright, innocent color in a world that was rapidly turning dark. Ethan watched his father load supplies into 2 large backpacks. Not just food and water, but climbing ropes, ice axes, and a small heavy-looking steel box that he handled with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Ethan," his father said, his voice tight, "come here." Ethan walked over, his own small backpack feeling flimsy and childish in comparison. His father knelt down, his hands on Ethan's shoulders. His eyes, usually full of distant dreams, were sharp and focused. Boring into him. "I need you to be a big boy on this trip," he said, his voice low. "A soldier. Can you do that for me?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "There are bad people in this world, son. People who take things that don't belong to them. We found something important, and they want it." He tapped the side of his head. "I have the map in here. The only map. But I need you to be my backup, my witness." He pulled a small disposable camera from his pocket. It was the kind you bought at a gas station. "I'm going to take some pictures of the rocks, the landmarks. If anything happens to me, or to these," he patted his backpack, "you use this. You show the police. You tell them what you saw. You understand. You are the witness." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Witness. It wasn't a word for an it was a word from the crime shows his mother wouldn't let him watch. That night, they left the campground. They didn't take the car. They slipped into the woods as the sun bled out behind the peaks, leaving their tent and smoldering campfire behind, as a decoy, a lie. They hiked for hours, his father navigating by the glowing screen of the GPS and the faint light of a crescent moon. Sarah, tired and whining, rode on his father's shoulders, her small head eventually slumping against his neck in sleep. His mother was silent, her face a pale, worried mask in the gloom. They moved through the darkness. The forest, a living thing around them. Its night sounds, a language of whispers and warnings. They were no longer a family on a camping trip. They were fugitives. The man who watched them go was not a fugitive. He was a hunter. His name was Deputy Miller, but everyone in town just called him Miller. He was a big man, with a gut that strained the buttons of his sheriff's department uniform, and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl of mild disappointment. He was Marcus Thorne's man. Not officially, of course, but everyone knew it. Thorne's company was the lifeblood of the town, and Miller's loyalty had been bought and paid 4 years ago with a steady stream of off-the-books consulting fees and the promise of a comfortable retirement. Thorne had called him. An hour ago. "Holloway's on the move," he'd said, his voice a cold, precise blade over the phone. "He's spooked. I want what he has, Miller. I don't care how you get it, just get it. And make sure he can't talk about it to anyone, ever." Miller sat in his patrol car, parked in the shadows at the edge of the Starlight Creek campground. The engine off, he watched the Holloway's abandoned campsite through a pair of binoculars. The fire was dying, the tent a silent, empty shell. He'd seen them leave, a family of ghosts melting into the trees. He knew these woods. He knew Holloway was an amateur. He'd get lost, or tired, or scared. He'd make a mistake. Miller was a patient man. He'd been a patient man for 20 years. Now, in 2024, he was Sheriff Miller, his gut a little bigger, his scowl a little deeper. The Holloway case was a cold case, a file box gathering dust in the back of the evidence room. It was his one great failure, the one black mark on an otherwise unremarkable career. At least, that's what he told people. In truth, it was his greatest success. He had done exactly what Marcus Thorne had paid him to do. He had made the Holloways disappear. He had followed them that night. He had waited until they were high in the mountains, exhausted and vulnerable, trapped on a ledge by an early unforecasted blizzard. He hadn't had to do much. The mountain had done most of the work for him. He'd just helped it along. A few well-placed shoves to the cornice of snow above their tent. A simple, elegant solution. No bodies, no evidence, just a family swallowed by the wilderness. He'd even led the search party himself, his face a mask of grim, professional concern. The only loose end had been the box, Holloway's precious lockbox. Miller had searched the wreckage after the avalanche, but it was gone. He'd assumed it was buried under tons of snow, lost forever. A minor, acceptable loss. Thorne had been furious, but there was nothing to be done. The secret of the Needle's Eye was safe. Until now. He stood in Benji's trailer, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. The kid was a blubbering mess, his face pale and tear-streaked. Miller had found him easily enough. A quick check of the Forestry Service drone logs, a visit to the kid's known associates. The old-timer Silas had sung like a canary, terrified of being implicated. "I found them," Benji sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at the monitor, where the drone footage was paused on the image of the frozen reaching hand. "The Holloways? I found them." Miller looked at the screen, his face impassive. But inside, his blood ran cold. The freak weather had uncovered his secret. After 20 years, his ghost story was coming back to haunt him. And this, Benji stammered, clicking to another file. The shaky footage from inside the mineshaft appeared. The glint of metal. The open lockbox. Miller's heart leaped. The box, it had survived, and the kid had seen it. "You didn't tell anyone else?" Miller asked, his voice calm, almost gentle. He put a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. Benji shook his head. "No, just you, Sheriff. I came straight to you." "You did the right thing, son," Miller said, his grip on the boy's shoulder tightening. "You're a hero." He looked around the trailer. The drone sat on a table, a silent, mechanical witness. The computer held the only copy of the footage. It was a loose end, and Miller was very, very good at tying up loose ends. "There's just one more thing we need to do," he said, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "We need to secure the evidence. Make sure it doesn't get into the wrong hands." He smiled, but it was the same smile Marcus Thorne had, the one that didn't reach his eyes. It was the last thing Benji ever saw. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the thick walls of the trailer, lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. Miller worked quickly, efficiently. He wiped the computer, smashed the drone, and staged the scene to look like a suicide. A troubled kid, a guilty conscience over something stupid. No one would question it. He drove away from the trailer, the drone's memory card, the only surviving copy of the footage, safe in his pocket. He had the coordinates. He had the secret. All he had to do was go up the mountain and retrieve the box before some other hiker or drone operator stumbled upon it. He would be the one to finally close the Holloway case. He would be the hero. He would bring the family's remains home, offer condolences to their long-grieving relatives. And the contents of that box? That would be his retirement. His final payment from Marcus Thorne, whether Thorne knew it or not. But there was one thing Miller didn't know. One variable he hadn't accounted for. In his haste, in his cold methodical cleanup, he had missed something, tucked under the seat of Benji's truck, where the boy had dropped it in his panicked rush to find Silas, was a small, cheap, disposable camera, the kind you buy at a gas station. And inside it, a roll of film that had been waiting 20 years to be developed. The backup? The witness? The conflict began not with a bang, but with a press conference. Sheriff Miller stood at a podium, his face a carefully constructed mask of somber authority. Behind him, A large higher-resolution photograph was projected onto a screen. It was the photo from Benji's drone, the tattered blue tent, the single red boot, the haunting, frozen landscape of the Widow's Needle. 20 years ago, Miller began, his voice resonating with practiced gravity. Our community was shattered by the disappearance of the Holloway family. Today, thanks to a tragic but heroic young man, we have finally found them. He spun a carefully edited tale. He told them about Benji, the troubled but civic-minded drone operator who, haunted by the old mystery, had taken it upon himself to search the inaccessible peaks. He told them how Benji had brought the evidence to him, and how, tragically, the weight of his discovery, combined with his own personal demons, had led him to take his own life. This young man's final act was one of profound service to this community, Miller declared, his eyes scanning the faces of the assembled reporters, and we will honor his memory by finally bringing the Holloways home. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. He was controlling the narrative, framing himself as the central figure in the resolution of the town's most painful mystery. He announced that a specialized state forensics team, along with his own deputies, would be undertaking the difficult and dangerous task of recovering the remains from the mountain. The area was, of course, sealed off. For the safety of the public, and to protect the integrity of the scene, the town wept. They mourned the Holloways all over again, and they mourned the tragic young hero who had found them. Flowers piled up outside the sheriff's office. Benji's estranged parents were flown in, their bewildered grief paraded before the local news cameras. Miller had orchestrated it all perfectly. He was in complete control. Miles away, in a sterile, glass-walled office overlooking a city of steel and smoke, Marcus Thorne watched the press conference on his computer. He was an old man now, his hair a fine, white mane, his body thinned by age, but his eyes were the same, cold, sharp, and predatory. He listened to Miller's speech, a flicker of something annoyance perhaps, or contempt, crossing his features. Miller was getting sloppy, sentimental, a hero. The fat, corrupt cop was a tool, nothing more. A blunt instrument he had used to solve a problem 20 years ago, but the discovery of the bodies was a complication. It stirred up old ghosts. He had built an empire on the secret of the needle's eye, a secret born from Mark Holloway's brilliant, obsessive research. Holloway had discovered a massive, untapped deposit of rare earth minerals, essential for the tech revolution that was just dawning in 2004. His geological surveys, the ones in that lockbox, were the foundation of Thorne's fortune. He had offered to buy them, but Holloway was an idealist. He wanted to publish his findings, to declare the area a protected geological site. He was a fool, a man who didn't understand how the world worked, so Thorne had arranged for him to be taught a lesson. A permanent one. Now, the fool's body was about to be brought down from the mountain, and with it, potentially, the lockbox. Thorne had called Miller immediately after seeing the news. The box, he'd rasped, his voice thin but still sharp with command. Did the boy see the box? The scene is secure, Miller had assured him, his voice a little too smooth, a little too confident. I'm handling it. The box is gone. Buried, nothing to worry about. Thorne didn't believe him. He knew Miller. The man was a greedy, predictable creature. If that box was up there, Miller would try to get it for himself. He was cutting his master out of the deal. It was an insult. A betrayal. Thorne had tolerated Miller's petty corruption for years, but this was different. This was a threat to the foundations of his legacy. He made a call to a different kind of contractor, a man who specialized in cleaning up loose ends. A man who was not on any official payroll. High on the mountain, the wind howled, a mournful, relentless cry. The recovery operation was a slow, arduous process. Miller was there every day, overseeing his deputies, his presence a constant, suffocating weight. He was playing the part of the dedicated sheriff. But his eyes were always scanning the rocks, searching for the fissure, the hidden entrance to the mine. He couldn't risk searching for it himself, not with the state forensics team crawling all over the site. He had to wait. He had to be patient. His plan was simple. Once the official recovery was complete and the teams were gone, he would return. Alone, he would find the mine, retrieve the box, and burn Holloway's research. The minerals themselves, the raw data, he would sell to the highest bidder on the international market, a private, untraceable sale. It would be his masterpiece, the culmination of a lifetime of quiet, patient corruption. But the mountain was not giving up its dead easily. The weather was turning, another storm front moving in. The forensics team was getting anxious, their city-bred professionalism fraying in the face of the raw, brutal power of the wilderness. They found the mother and father first, zipped into their frozen sleeping bags, their faces peaceful, almost serene, as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. They found the little girl, Sarah, curled between them, her small body sheltered from the worst of the storm. But the boy, Ethan, was missing. They searched for 2 days. They swept the entire ledge, probed the deep snowdrifts, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished, just as his family had, 20 years before. Miller felt a prickle of unease. He remembered that night. The blizzard, the avalanche. He had assumed the boy was buried with the others. But what if he had survived? What if, by some miracle, he had crawled out of the wreckage and stumbled away into the storm? It seemed impossible. An 11-year-old boy, alone, in a blizzard, miles from civilization. He would have died of exposure within hours. His body would be up here somewhere, another frozen secret for the mountain to keep. But the unease lingered. A loose thread, a question without an answer. The discovery of the missing boy made the news, adding another layer of tragedy to the story. The public's obsession with the case intensified. It was a perfect storm of human drama. A lost family, a dead hero, a missing child, and then, the first betrayal. One of Miller's own deputies, a young, ambitious officer named Evans, started asking questions. Evans had been tasked with processing Benji's truck, which had been towed to the impound lot. He was a sharp kid, a detail-oriented cop who hadn't yet learned the art of looking the other way. Sheriff. He said one afternoon, catching Miller in the hallway of the station. Something's not right about the kid's suicide. Miller's gut tightened. What are you talking about, Evans? The angle of the gunshot wound. It's awkward for a self-inflicted wound. And there was no note. His phone records show he was trying to call an old-timer named Silas just before he supposedly shot himself. I talked to Silas. He said the kid was scared, but excited. He said he'd found something big. It doesn't track, Sheriff. A kid like that doesn't just decide to end it all an hour later. Miller fixed him with a cold, hard stare. Are you questioning my judgment, Deputy? No, sir, Evans said, taking a step back. It's just, there was something else. Under the driver's seat, it looked like a toy. He held up a small evidence bag. Inside it was a disposable camera. Miller's blood turned to ice. The camera, the witness. The one detail he had missed. It's probably nothing, he said, forcing a casual tone. Junk from the previous owner. Bag it and tag it. The case is closed, Evans. Let the dead rest. He walked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get that camera. He had to destroy it. But Evans was a Boy Scout. He would have logged it into evidence. It would be in the lockup. Miller would have to get it himself, and he'd have to do it without raising suspicion. The pressure was mounting. Thorne was calling him twice a day, his voice a venomous whisper. On the other end of the line, the state police were still on the mountain, and now, Evans, his own deputy, was sniffing around the edges of the truth. His perfect plan was unraveling, thread by thread. He grew bolder, more reckless. He drove up to the sealed-off access road to the Widow's Needle late one night. Using his authority to bypass the state police checkpoint, he told them he was doing one last sweep. He hiked towards the recovery site under the cold white light of a full moon, a shovel, and a powerful flashlight in his pack. He was done waiting. He would find the mine tonight. The wind was a physical force, trying to push him off the ridge. The air was thin and bit at his lungs. He found the tattered remains of the tent, a ghostly blue shroud flapping in the gale. From there, he paced off the 50 yards the drone footage had shown. His flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and then he saw it. The fissure. The dark narrow cleft in the rock. His heart leaped. He scrambled towards it, his boots slipping on the icy scree. He was there. He was finally there. He shone his light into the opening. It was a mineshaft, just as the drone had shown. Old rotten timbers shored up the entrance. A wave of foul stagnant air washed over him. He hesitated for a second, a primal fear of the dark, enclosed space warring with his greed. The greed won. He stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight cut a nervous path through the darkness. The floor was littered with fallen rock and the droppings of some animal. He saw the path, the trail of disturbed dust leading deeper inside. He followed it, his breath pluming in the frigid air, and then he saw the box. It was just lying there, not 50 feet from the entrance, exactly where the drone had seen it. It was open, its contents spilled across the floor. He fell to his knees, his hands shaking. He shone the light on the spilled treasure. It wasn't gold. It wasn't jewels. It was rocks. Core samples. Dozens of them. Each one tagged and numbered. And papers. Geological charts. Survey data. Pages and pages of handwritten notes. Mark Holloway's life's work. The foundation of Marcus Thorne's Empire. Miller began to laugh, a harsh, breathless sound that echoed strangely in the confined space. He had it. He had it all. He was so focused on the box, so consumed by his victory, that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him. He didn't sense the presence in the darkness until it was too late. A voice, quiet and cold as the grave, spoke from the shadows. "You're not the only one who knows this place, Sheriff." Miller spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. He raised his flashlight. The beam fell upon a face. A man's face, thin and gaunt, with eyes that burned with a cold, 20-year-old fire. He was dressed in rags, his hair long and matted, his beard a wild tangle. But the face, beneath the grime and the hardship, the face was unmistakable. It was the face of a boy who had been 11 years old the last time Miller had seen him. A boy who should have been dead. "Ethan," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "Ethan Holloway." The man smiled, but it was a terrifying sight, a baring of teeth in the pale, haunted face. "You took my family," he said, his voice a low, raw growl. "Now, you're going to help me get them back." He took a step forward, out of the shadows. In his hand, he held a rusty ice axe. It was poised, ready to swing. And behind him, deeper in the mine, something else moved. A shape, large and dark, its eyes glinting in the reflected light of Miller's flashlight. The animal whose droppings littered the floor. A mountain lion, its muscles coiled, its gaze fixed on the sheriff. It was thin, but powerful, and it was not afraid. It was a pet. Miller was trapped. Trapped between the ghost of the boy he had tried to murder, and a wild animal that looked at him like he was meat. The mine was no longer a treasure chest, it was a tomb, and the door had just been sealed. The plot twist didn't come from a hidden recording or a forgotten diary. It came from a roll of cheap 20-year-old film. Deputy Evans, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, had taken the disposable camera from the evidence lockup. He hadn't logged it out, he'd just taken it. It was a breach of protocol, the kind of thing that could get him fired, but his gut screamed at him that this was important. He took it to the 1-hour photo kiosk at the local pharmacy, a relic from a bygone era run by an old woman who still believed in the magic of chemical baths and glossy paper. An hour later, he spread the developed photographs across his kitchen table. Most of them were what you'd expect from a family camping trip. A blurry picture of a smiling woman in a folding chair. A shot of a little girl with a gap-toothed grin, holding up a fistful of wildflowers. A picture of a man's boots, standing on a rock. But then there were the others. They were different. They were deliberate. A close-up of a strangely shaped rock formation. A shot of a particular bend in a creek. A photo of a lone dead pine tree on a ridge, its branches like skeletal arms against the sky. They were landmarks, a visual map. And then, the last photo. On the roll, it was taken from a distance, with a shaky hand. It showed a man, his back to the camera, standing near the same dead pine tree as in the previous shot. He was talking to another man. The second man was in uniform, a sheriff's deputy uniform. The photo was grainy, the faces indistinct, but the shape of the man, the distinctive slump of his shoulders, the gut straining the fabric of his shirt, it was unmistakable. It was a younger, thinner Sheriff Miller, and he was handing the other man Mark Holloway an envelope. Evans stared at the photograph, his blood running cold. This wasn't a picture of a chance encounter. This was a meeting, a transaction. What was a deputy doing meeting a man, off the record, deep in the wilderness, just before he and his family disappeared forever? He cross-referenced the landmarks in the photos with the topographical maps from the original 2004 search. He found the dead pine, the bend in the creek. Holloway hadn't been lost. He had been following a specific route, a route that led directly towards the widow's needle. The official story was a lie, the whole thing. Miller hadn't been a bumbling small-town cop failing to solve a mystery. He had been part of it. Evans's hands were shaking. He was just a small-town deputy. Miller was the sheriff. He was a local institution. To accuse him of this, it was career suicide, or worse. He thought of Benji, the kid who had found the tent, now dead in an apparent suicide. He thought of Miller's insistence that the case was closed. He was covering it up. He had been covering it up for 20 years. He had to do something, but he couldn't go through official channels. Miller controlled the department. He would bury it. He would bury Evans. He needed help. He needed someone outside the system, someone with power, someone who couldn't be intimidated. He remembered a name from the old case files, a reporter from a big city newspaper who had covered the Holloway disappearance extensively back in '04. She had been aggressive, relentless, and had written a series of articles suggesting a cover-up, hinting that the local authorities were incompetent, or, worse, complicit. She had been run out of town, her theories dismissed as sensationalist conspiracy-mongering. Her name was Sarah Jensen. Evans found her online. She wasn't with the newspaper anymore. She was an independent journalist, a podcaster with a cult following who specialized in cold cases and corporate corruption. Her website was called The Unburied Truth. He sent her an email. The subject line was, "Holloway case. I have proof." He attached a scan of the final photograph. The one of Miller and Holloway, a ghost from a disposable camera. 2,000 miles away, Sarah Jensen opened the email. She stared at the photograph, and the years fell away. She remembered the hostility, the stonewalling, the threats. She remembered the look in Sheriff Miller's eyes when he'd told her to go back to the city and stop bothering his grieving town. She had always known there was more to the story. And now, here it was. The proof, the ghost. She booked the first flight she could find. While Evans was making his desperate plea for help, Miller was living his own personal nightmare. He was a prisoner in the mine. Ethan Holloway was a ghost made real, a specter of vengeance forged in the crucible of 20 years of solitude and grief. He had not died in the storm. He had crawled from the wreckage of the tent, his leg broken, his mind shattered by what he had seen. He had seen Miller, standing on the ridge above, a silhouette against the swirling snow, watching as the avalanche he had triggered buried his family alive. Ethan had stumbled into the mine shaft. The only shelter he could find, he had survived. On insects and melted snow, his hatred for Miller the only thing that kept him from succumbing to the pain and the cold. He had found his father's lockbox, his geological notes, and he had read them. He had learned the secret of the needle's eye, and he had waited. The mountain had become his home. The animals his only companions. The mountain lion, a cub he had found half dead near its frozen mother, had become his guard dog, his weapon, his only friend. He was no longer a boy. He was a creature of the wilderness, as wild and unforgiving as the landscape that had shaped him. He kept Miller alive, tethered by a rope to a timber deep inside the mine. He fed him scraps of raw meat, the same food he and the lion ate. Forced him to read his father's journals aloud, his voice a hoarse croak in the darkness. The deposit is stable. Miller read, his voice trembling. The yield could power the country for a decade. It must be protected. It belongs to the earth, not to men like Thorne. Again, Ethan would command, his voice flat and dead. And Miller would read it again. It was a form of torture. More profound than any physical pain, he was being forced to bear witness to the idealism of the man he had murdered. To understand the magnitude of what had been lost. Days bled into a week. Miller grew weak, his mind starting to fray in the absolute darkness. He babbled, he pleaded, he confessed. He told Ethan everything. He told him about Thorne, about the money, about the cover-up. He told him how he had murdered Benji, the drone operator, to protect the secret. Ethan listened, his face a stony mask. The confession changed nothing. His course was set. He wasn't interested in justice, not the kind that happened in a courtroom. He wanted something more elemental. He wanted retribution. Down in the town, things were escalating. Sarah Jensen had arrived, and she was a whirlwind. She wasn't just a reporter anymore, she was a one-woman media outlet. She set up in a motel room, her laptops and recording equipment covering every surface. She met with Evans in secret, in the dead of night. He gave her everything he had, the photos, his notes on Benji's death. His suspicions about Miller. Sarah started broadcasting. Her podcast, which usually dropped once a week, was now a daily bulletin. She laid out the inconsistencies in the official story. She presented the photograph of Miller and Holloway as an exhibit. She raised questions about Benji's convenient suicide. She interviewed old-timers who remembered Miller's close relationship with Thorne's mining company. She created a firestorm. The story went national. The unburied truth was trending. The town was swarming with news vans. The state police, humiliated and under pressure, reopened the investigation into Benji's death. They re-examined his truck, and this time they found the disposable camera, or rather, they found the empty space where it was supposed to be in the evidence log. Evans, under immense pressure, confessed to taking it. He was suspended, but he had done his job. The conspiracy was no longer a theory, it was a fact. Marcus Thorne, watching his empire of secrets crumble, made his final move. He couldn't let Miller be taken alive. The fat cop knew too much. He would sing, and he would drag Thorne down with him. The contractor he had sent to clean up was already in place, a ghost in the mountains, waiting for the signal. The state police organized a new search party, this time for their own missing sheriff. They focused on the widow's needle. Sarah Jensen was with them, her camera rolling, live streaming to her massive audience. The whole world was watching. High on the mountain, Ethan Holloway knew they were coming. He could hear the distant thwomp of a helicopter. He could smell the scent of exhaust on the wind. It was time. He dragged Miller from the mine, blinking and whimpering, into the pale grey light of dawn. He tied him to the tattered remains of the blue tent, the same tent where his family had died. He placed the open lockbox at Miller's feet, the geological surveys and core samples spilling out onto the snow. "They're coming for you, Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They're going to ask you what happened. I want you to tell them the truth." Miller stared at him, his eyes wide with terror. "They'll kill me," he whispered. "Thorne's man, he's out there." "Yes," Ethan said, "he is." He looked up at the ridge above them, the same ridge where he had seen Miller standing 20 years ago. A lone figure was silhouetted against the sky. Thorne's cleaner. He had a rifle. "This is your choice," Ethan said, his voice a low growl. "You can tell them what you did, and let them take you, or you can stay silent, and let him take you." He pressed something cold and metallic into Miller's hand. It was a flare gun. "There's a third option," Ethan said, his lips curling. Into that terrifying smile, "You can be the hero you always pretended to be. You can expose him, all of them. Bring the whole rotten house down." He pointed to the ridge. "Or you can just be another body on the mountain." Ethan stepped back, melting into the rocks, the mountain lion a silent shadow at his side. He was gone. Miller was alone, tied to a ghost, with a flare gun in his hand. The sound of the helicopter grew louder. The figure on the ridge raised his rifle. The whole world was watching. The choice was his. Justice or silence. Life or death. The camera was rolling. The final, terrible act was about to begin. The cinematic payoff was not a courtroom bombshell or a dramatic arrest. It was a single, desperate act, broadcast live to millions. Sheriff Miller, haggard and broken, sat tied to the shredded blue tent, a pathetic king on a throne of frozen tragedy. The wind whipped his thin hair across his face, and his eyes darted frantically between the approaching helicopter and the lone figure with the rifle on the ridge above. He was trapped in a crucible of his own making, the sins of 2 decades converging on him in one terrible moment. Sarah Jensen's voice, a calm, steady narration over the live feed, explained the scene to her breathless audience. We are approaching the site where the Holloway family was found. We have visual confirmation of a single individual tied to the tent. We are attempting to identify. Wait, that looks like Sheriff Miller. The world leaned closer to its screens. The helicopter, a state police bird, began its slow descent, rotors churning the snow into a blinding whirlwind. On the ridge, Thorne's assassin, a professional named Kane, adjusted his aim. He had his orders. Miller could not be allowed to talk. It was supposed to be a clean, simple job. But the live streaming reporter had complicated things. A public execution was messy. He would have to make it look like something else. Miller's mind was a maelstrom of terror and calculation. He saw the rifle, he saw the helicopter. He knew what Ethan had offered him was not a choice, but a sentence. He could die silently, a loose end tied up by Thorne's assassin, his legacy that of a corrupt cop who got what he deserved. Or he could die in a blaze of something. Not glory. Something uglier. Something true. He looked down at the lockbox. At his feet, Mark Holloway's life's work. The rocks, the papers, the proof. He looked at the flare gun in his trembling hand. It was a weapon, of a sort. Not against the rifle, but against the silence. His decision was made in the space of a heartbeat. It wasn't about redemption. It was about revenge. If he was going down, he was taking Marcus Thorne with him. He raised the flare gun, not at the assassin on the ridge, but at the helicopter. He pulled the trigger. A brilliant red star shot into the sky, exploding in a shower of crimson sparks against the flat grey canvas of the sky. It was a universal signal of distress. But it was also a signal of defiance. A final, desperate cry for attention. On the ridge, Kane cursed. The flare had drawn every eye. He couldn't take the shot now. Not without everyone seeing it. He had to create a distraction. Miller wasn't done. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he began to scream. His voice, raw and torn, was picked up by the helicopter's boom mic, broadcast to the world. Thorne. It was Marcus Thorne. He killed them. He paid me to do it. Sarah Jensen's eyes widened. Did you hear that? She said, her voice electric. He's confessing. He's confessing live on air. The helicopter landed, and state troopers, guns drawn, began to advance on the screaming, weeping sheriff. But Kane, on the ridge, was already putting his backup plan into motion. He wasn't just a sniper. He was a demolitions expert. He had come prepared for any contingency. He pulled a small detonator from his pocket. He had planted charges earlier that morning at the base of the unstable cornice of snow that loomed directly above the ledge. The same cornice Miller had disturbed 20 years earlier. He pressed the button. The explosion was a dull, heavy thump, not a crack. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a spiderweb of cracks appeared across the face of the massive snowpack. With a groan that seemed to come from the mountain's very soul, the cornice gave way. A river of white death, tons of snow and ice, cascaded down the mountainside, directly towards the ledge. Avalanche, a trooper screamed. Get back to the chopper. The scene dissolved into chaos. The troopers scrambled back, their disciplined advance forgotten in the face of the overwhelming power of the mountain. Sarah Jensen's camera operator, a veteran of war zones, stood his ground. keeping the lens pointed at the unfolding disaster. Miller watched the wall of snow coming for him, his screams turning into a gurgle of pure terror. This was it. The same death he had delivered to the Holloways. The mountain was claiming him. A perfect, terrible symmetry. But as the avalanche roared down, something else happened. From the rocks near the mine entrance, another figure emerged. It was Ethan. He moved with a preternatural speed, his body lean and powerful. He wasn't running from the avalanche. He was running towards Miller. He reached the sheriff just as the first wave of snow hit the ledge. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the ropes that bound Miller with a hunting knife. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed the front of Miller's jacket and began to drag him, kicking and screaming, towards the only possible shelter, the mine shaft. The mountain lion was there, at the entrance, letting out a terrifying guttural roar at the approaching wall of white. Miller shrieked, his mind unable to process what was happening. "Why are you saving me?" Ethan's face was a mask of cold fury. "He doesn't get to kill you," he snarled, his voice barely audible over the thunder of the snow. "I do." He threw Miller into the mouth of the mine just as the full force of the avalanche hit. The world went white. The camera feed cut to static. The live stream went dead. For a heart-stopping minute, the world held its breath. When the picture returned, it was a shaky, handheld shot from inside the helicopter as it lifted off, escaping the massive plume of snow and ice that now engulfed the entire area. The ledge was gone. The tent, the lockbox, everything was buried under 100 feet of new snow. The world believed that Sheriff Miller, Ethan Holloway, and Thorne's assassin were all dead, swallowed by the mountain. The story was over. A tragedy compounded by another tragedy. But the story wasn't over. Because one thing had survived. Just before the avalanche hit, as Ethan was dragging Miller to the mine, Sarah Jensen, watching from the helicopter, saw it. Miller had dropped the lockbox. But Ethan, with his free hand, had scooped up a handful of the papers that had spilled from it. Just a handful. And then he had disappeared into the mine. The avalanche had buried the bodies, but it hadn't buried the truth. The aftermath was a media frenzy. Marcus Thorne, implicated by Miller's dying confession, was besieged. His company's stock plummeted. Federal investigators, armed with the live-streamed confession and Sarah Jensen's relentless reporting, descended on his corporate headquarters. His empire of secrets began to crumble. Thorne, ever the survivor, tried to pin everything on Miller. He painted him as a rogue agent, a corrupt cop who had acted alone, driven by greed. He denied everything. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The world had heard Miller's scream. And then, the final piece of evidence emerged. 2 weeks after the avalanche, a package arrived at Sarah Jensen's office. It had no return address. It was postmarked from a tiny forgotten town 100 miles north of the Widow's Needle. Inside was a tattered, waterproof pouch. And inside the pouch were a dozen pages of geological surveys, covered in the elegant, precise handwriting of Mark Holloway. At the bottom of the last page, there was a fresh inscription, written in a rough, almost childish scrawl. He said, "It belongs to the earth. Make sure it does." It was from Ethan. He was alive. He had escaped, somehow, through the labyrinthine tunnels of the old mine, emerging miles away. He had sent her the proof. The heart of his father's work. Sarah published the documents. They were undeniable. They proved that Thorne knew about the massive rare earth mineral deposit, the largest in North America, had concealed its existence for 20 years. All while his company systematically bought up the land and mineral rights around the Widow's Needle for pennies on the dollar. The motive was now clear. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was the crime of the century. The public outcry was deafening. Thorne's carefully constructed world collapsed. He was arrested, his face a mask of disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. The image was on every news channel. The Titan had fallen. The cinematic payoff wasn't just his arrest, it was what happened next. The federal government, armed with Holloway's research, stepped in. They used the principle of eminent domain, not to seize the land for drilling, but to protect it. citing the unique and invaluable nature of the geological find. They declared the entire Widow's Needle Range a national monument, a protected wilderness area, forever off-limits to mining and development. Mark Holloway's dream, the one he had died for, had come true. The land was safe, it belonged to the earth. The final poetic twist came during Thorne's trial. The prosecution's star witness was a surprise. A man who walked into the courtroom, not in the rags of a wild man, but in clean, borrowed clothes, his hair cut, his face clean-shaven. He was thin, haunted, and his eyes held the weight of 20 lost years. But he was there. Ethan Holloway, he had come down from the mountain. He had come to bear witness. He stood before the court, before the world, and he told his story. He told them about the greed, the betrayal, the avalanche. He told them about the long dark years of solitude, and he told them about his father's dream. His testimony was quiet, understated, and utterly devastating. He didn't need to raise his voice. His very existence was an accusation. He was the ghost who had come back to point the finger. Marcus Thorne was convicted on all counts. He would die in prison, a disgraced old man, his name a synonym for corporate greed and corruption. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The snow falls softly on the new granite headstone. It doesn't bear a name, but an inscription. The Holloway family. Mark, Linda, Sarah, and Ethan. They loved these mountains. Now they are part of them. There are no bodies buried here, only memories. The town, in an act of collective atonement, had insisted on the memorial, placed at the trailhead that leads towards the newly christened Holloway National Monument. Ethan stands before it, his hands in the pockets of a jacket that still feels foreign to him. It's been a year since the trial, a year of trying to learn how to live in a world of flat surfaces, processed food, and the constant, meaningless chatter of civilization. He has a small apartment in the town, paid for by a victims' compensation fund. He has a therapist who tells him he's making remarkable progress. He has learned to use a fork again, to sleep in a bed, to not see every stranger as a potential threat. But he is not healed. He is not whole. He is a mosaic of scar tissue, a man forever caught between two worlds. He tried to find a place in the new world. He got a job, for a while, working with the Forestry Service, the same service that had employed Benji. He was good at it. He knew the woods, the weather, the secrets of the high peaks. But he couldn't stand the noise of the chainsaws, the casual way his co-workers spoke of taming the wilderness. To them, it was a resource. To him, it was a cathedral and a tomb. He comes here, to the memorial, most days. It's the only place that feels real. He is not alone today. Sarah Jensen stands a respectful distance away, her camera off, her notebook put away. They have formed a strange, unspoken friendship. She is the only one who doesn't look at him with pity or morbid curiosity. She looks at him with understanding. She knows what it's like to be haunted by a story. They're naming the highest peak after your father, she says softly, her breath pluming in the cold air. Holloway's Peak. Ethan nods, but doesn't speak. He looks past the headstone, towards the jagged white silhouette of the Widow's Needle, now a monument to his family's sacrifice. He had won. He had brought down the giant, he had saved his father's legacy, he had found justice. But the victory tastes like ash in his mouth. He thinks of Miller, the fat, terrified sheriff. Ethan had not killed him. In the chaos of the avalanche, as the mine shaft began to groan and collapse around them, he had shown Miller a way out, a little-known ventilation shaft that led to the surface, miles away. He had let him go. He had realized, in that final terrible moment, that killing Miller would make him a prisoner forever, chained to the memory of his own vengeance. His freedom, he understood, was not in taking a life, but in choosing not to. Miller had been found a week later, wandering delirious in the woods. He is now in a maximum security prison, in protective custody, where he will spend the rest of his miserable life looking over his shoulder. He is a ghost in his own right, haunting a concrete cell instead of a mountain. Ethan's therapist tells him this was a breakthrough. An act of profound self-preservation. Ethan knows it was simply an act of exhaustion. He was tired of the hate. It had kept him alive for 20 years, but it was a fuel that burned the engine clean out. "What will you do now?" Sarah asks. Her question gentle. It's the question everyone asks. It's the question he asks himself every morning when he wakes up in his small, quiet apartment, the silence a roaring in his ears. He doesn't have an answer. He is a man out of time, a relic of a story that has already been told. The world has moved on. The news cycle has churned. The outrage has faded. The viral moment has passed. All that is left is the quiet, the cold, and the long, empty years ahead. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, smooth stone. A core sample. He'd kept one, just one, a piece of his father's dream. He rubs his thumb over its cool, polished surface. "I think," he says, his voice raspy from disuse, "I'll go for a walk." He turns away from the memorial, away from Sarah, and starts down the trail that leads into the monument. The trail that leads home. He doesn't know if he's going back for a day, or for good. He only knows that the silence of the mountains is a language he still understands. The world of men, of laws and money and fleeting justice, had taken everything from him. The wilderness, in its brutal, indifferent way, had given him something back. It had given him himself. Sarah watches him go, a lone figure walking back into the white, until he is just a speck against the vastness of the landscape. He is not a hero. He is not a victim. He is a survivor. And his story, she knows, is not over. It has simply returned to the place where it began. In the deep, silent heart of the mountains, where some secrets are better left buried, and some ghosts can never truly be laid to rest. The snow begins to fall harder, covering his tracks, erasing his path, as if the mountain itself is taking him back, folding him into its cold, eternal embrace. The emotional echo of his loss, and his strange, terrible victory, will linger here. Forever, a whisper on the wind that blows across the high, lonely peaks, a haunting reminder of the price of truth and the cost of survival.